say to all the participants that this session will be recorded. And of course, on behalf of Observare and the National Defense Institute, I'd like to welcome to our students and all the participants, and of course, by thanking and welcoming our distinguished guest speaker, Mark Meirowitz. Mark Meirowitz is a professor at State University of New York, Maritime College, where he teaches American foreign policy, American history, constitutional law, and a graduate course on ocean politics and law, among other courses. Professor Meirowitz holds a PhD in political science. His thesis dealt with the law of the sea, and is also a lawyer. He lectures and writes on international relations issues, mainly with respect to Turkish-US relations and China-US relations, including 2 articles published in the latest Janus yearbook that I will make available in the Zoom chat. He has presented at various international conferences, including 2 days ago. Professor Mark Meirowitz participated in an excellent roundtable discussion at the conference Europe as a Global Actor, co-organized by CICLO and Observare, and he also serves as a referee for international journals, including our JanusNet Journal of International Relations. Professor Mark Meirowitz, once again, many thanks for being available to share with us your perspectives and insights. We look forward to your lecture on American perspectives on the South China Sea. So please, the stage is yours.
Well, I wanted to express again my thanks to you, especially Professor Tomei, for being always so gracious to me and for allowing me the privilege of participating in these very, very interesting projects and programs. It means a great deal to me. And of course, it's great to see Professor Gaspar again and to participate with him and remember our nice conversations when I was at the conference at the university, which I miss and hope to come back to very, very soon. The topic of the American perspectives on the South China Sea, I would like to perhaps expand that a little bit. I will talk about the South China Sea, but it's really all about American. Okay, I was muted. Now I was okay. Can you hear? Okay, perspectives on China and China-U.S. relations at the present time. Certainly, the South China Sea and the Indo-Pacific region are very fundamental, but the relationship is very fraught, very difficult at the present time. Let me just say this, you know, there seems to be a great deal of concern and worry in many parts of our government, American government, on China's rise, the implications of that rise, and also let's say the environmental, let's say the atmospherics between the 2 countries have not been very good lately. We had the kind of the shouting match in Anchorage between the U.S. and China. A number of very strong things were stated at that time. And we also had the talk that Councilor Wang Yi, the foreign minister, gave to the Council on Foreign Relations, which I'm going to, if I have a chance, like to quote from, because it's really an eye-opener. But if you look at the documents that are produced in our Director of National Intelligence by the Secretary of Defense, you will see a rising concern with what China is up to and perhaps some frustration and to try to figure out what to do about it. You know, and you know, the military people like Admiral Davidson, who was the outgoing head of the Indo-Pacific Command, he basically says America has to be ready to fight a war if it needs to fight a war. That's a pretty strong statement, but it's from a military officer. But that leads me to become quite worried about it. But first of all, let me start with this idea. The Defense Department put out a very important annual report on military and security developments involving the People's Republic of China. And here are just a few things that they say, just a few things, and you'll get the flavor of it. The People's Republic of China's strategy aims to achieve the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation by 2049. a determined pursuit of political and social modernity, far-ranging efforts to expand China's national power, and so forth. China frames the strategy as an effort to realize long-held nationalist aspirations to return China to a position of strength, prosperity, and leadership on the world stage. The PRC's foreign policy seeks to revise aspects of the international order on the parties' terms, in accordance with ideas and principles it views as essential to forging an external environment conducive to China's national rejuvenation. The PRC recognized its armed forces should take a more active role in advancing its foreign policy. So there's further discussion about the military-civil fusion policy. But here's where it gets very worrisome, because it states here that China has already achieved parity with or even exceeded the United States in several military modernization areas. For example, shipbuilding. The PRC has the largest navy in the world with a battle force of approximately 350 battleships and submarines. And the United States, in comparison, has 293 ships as of early 2020, and so forth and so on. In other words, there was reason to worry. Now, one thing that, again, without going into details here, but the one thing that is particularly worrisome is the, let's say, the militarization of the Belt and Road Initiative and the use of the Belt and Road Initiative and other factors, including the String of Pearls, to expand China's influence worldwide. The PRC is seeking to establish a more robust overseas logistics and basing infrastructure to allow the PLA, to the People's Liberation Army, to project and sustain military power at great distance. But the next paragraph is a real eye-opener. Beyond its current base in Djibouti, the PRC is planning overseas military logistics facilities to support naval, air, and ground forces. It has considered locations for PLA military logistics, Myanmar, Thailand, Singapore, Indonesia, on and on and on, right? And also in the PRC in Cambodia, and I think this has particularly been confirmed, have denied having signed an agreement to provide the PLA, the People's Liberation Army Navy, with access to Cambodia's Ream Naval Base. All of this, and there's a lot more to it, is very, very worrisome to the United States. What do we do about this? What does this mean? How does it manifest itself? It manifests itself in a number of places and platforms, and principally of late, clearly in Taiwan, Hong Kong, South China Sea, and in the treatment of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. All of these developments are very, very troublesome. It's not just the threat to free navigation in the South China Sea and the effort, which is the sort of the focus of this, but you can't really just look at that. You have to look really comprehensively at what China is doing worldwide. Now, in their claims in the South China Sea, which I will talk about, basically have been debunked. But China is not deterred. China is not deterred. It is not deterred in any way by pursuing its approach to its rising power. And I said, there's a tremendous frustration, even our Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, when she spoke, she talked about China's a rising power and it sees itself as a zero-sum game with the United States. All these things that we read amount to an utter conundrum on the part of the United States foreign policy planners on how to address this problem. Now, I will say, just to step back for a moment, how did we get to this situation? How did we get to the place where we are, where we sort of now come to the realization that China is rising? It's sort of this Thucydides trap, the rising power against the major power in the world, Athens and Sparta, all the different comparisons that have been made to this. But the concept always was the United States brought China to WTO, the China opening, all the things that were done Kissinger's China opening with Nixon. They were all done to bring China into the community of nations, to make China part of the community of nations, to make it a country that would operate by the rules of what we call the international order. But that does not appear to have been the motivation of China. I would, just as a digression in a sense with Iran, again, the idea with Iran is, we negotiate a deal with Iran, and then they'll just negotiate with us, and then they'll just comply with whatever agreements we make. But that's not the case. They don't comply with agreements that they make. They specifically absolutely don't comply with agreements. And similarly, China. So China has a greater ideological and philosophical purpose that is overarching to everything. And again, if you go back a little bit in history, you see this biding our time. China was always biding our time, but now suddenly it's there. And the question is, what does it all mean and what do we do about it? Now, it's very interesting that we have a new regime. We have a new, as we say, new sheriff in town, new boss, new president came in, defeated Donald Trump. Donald Trump's policy against China was very strong. He talked about the China virus. He was very, very, very negative towards China. Now comes in the new regime, and we have President Biden and Secretary of State Antony Blinken. So the question is, according to Secretary of State, what is his approach in dealing with this problem? Okay, so the questions he's asked at a recent press conference, right? Let's talk about China, the biggest strategic challenge the United States now faces. Okay, so he says, that you had this whole, kerfuffle in Alaska, you had this conflict, and the Chinese weren't too happy with that, and they wouldn't accept interference with core issues, whether it's Tibet, Taiwan, Xinjiang. What did you learn about the Chinese approach that you may not have known? Okay, I'm not sure we learned anything new. This is amazing. Okay, we didn't learn anything new. But then he says, this is very important. He says, we are not about trying to contain China or to hold China down. What we are about is upholding the international rules-based order that we've invested so much in over many decades, that has served us well, and not just us. Served the world pretty well, including, by the way, China. Anyone who takes action that would disrupt that order, that would challenge that order, that would seek to undermine it, we're going to stand up and protect it. Doesn't really say how. And then, of course, he talks about the Uyghurs, he talks about Taiwan, he talks about Tibet. On Xinjiang, he says, Secretary Blinken, when it comes to Xinjiang, China signed on to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights at the United Nations. It's a very interesting approach. You signed an agreement. You said you would do something, but you didn't do it. Okay? But you should be following agreements that you sign on to. But no. The Chinese Communist Party and what it mandates is supreme and takes precedence over whatever you sign. Always is to gain advantage. It's not to adhere to these agreements. To go again back to the point, which I think is really pivotal here, the United States says it's not about to contain China or to hold China down. Now, what does that mean? And the policy the United States had towards the Soviet Union was containment. George F. Kennan, containment. Contain the Soviet Union. So we're not talking about containing China, but when you listen to the military people testify, you hear a completely different approach. So I think from the people who are looking at this, trying to understand what to do about it, our main diplomat is saying we want them to adhere to the rules-based international order. Now, it's interesting because when Councilor Wang spoke to the Council on Foreign Relations, he basically took the position that, who makes the rules-based order? Whose rules are they? He says, if the rules are made by the Western countries only, well, that's only 12% of the world's population. And that shouldn't be the universal rules. We need to uphold the UN-centered international system and the international order underpinned by international law. Now, again, as I said in the last talk that we had the other day, that's a great statement, by a country, but if I hear it from the United States, and the United States says it's going to adhere to an international law, I think that has credibility. When the Chinese say we're going to uphold the UN-centered international system and the international order underpinned by international law, that is belied and debunked by their actual behavior, particularly on the South China Sea. I mean, really? I mean, they follow international law. I mean, it's almost beyond, one's mind implodes when we read about the case that the Philippines brought in the Permanent Court of Arbitration, which I'll talk about in a moment. But I just want to say about Councillor Wang. I mean, the approach that China's taking towards the United States, I think one could say it's quite belligerent. And I think that it's kind of interesting. I don't know if you read in the news that the Chinese have been sending these so-called foreign fishing fleets, which don't fish. They just bottle up Philippines and prevent them from fishing. I can't even quote it on the Zoom, but the foreign minister, Theodore Luxon, he basically said to China, China, my friend, how politely can I put it? Let me see, get the F out. Excuse me, I didn't mean anything, Luis, by saying that. I just quoted it. That's the foreign minister of Philippines to China. To China. What are you doing to our friendship? You, not us. We're trying. You're like an ugly oaf, forcing your attention on a handsome guy who wants to be a friend, not to father a Chinese province. Really? Now, this is the same Philippines dispute where when the Permanent Court of Arbitration issued its ruling, China lost on every single point. Every point of international law, it lost. Every one. Chinese said, the decision of the Permanent Court of Arbitration is a piece of trash paper. And I reiterate the point that this is the same country, the same nation, whose foreign minister says they respect international law. They respect it as a piece of trash paper. Okay? Now, it is true that Rodrigo Duterte, not to fight with Goliath, said, at the beginning when they said that, he sort of calmed it down. I mean, I think the relationship that China has with these smaller, not smaller powers, but these other powers is going to be the linchpin of how this all develops on and on. Now, just again, why are we where we at with this? And then I think it's important to reiterate some of the points that General McMaster has made in his very, very interesting book called Battleground. And I've actually heard him give a lecture at the National Defense University, which just be amazing. And he actually participated in my American foreign policy class. He actually remotely participated in my class, and it was really amazing. I mean, I think he hits the nail on the head, and that's this concept of strategic narcissism. He has strategic narcissism and strategic empathy, and also strategic competence. But the most important one is that the leadership in the United States, and I dare say in the other countries in the world, including Australia, Europe, you name it, have been living in a dream world where we think that the adversary, we just interpret their actions by our standards or by our analysis. It doesn't work like that. Sometimes you need a rude awakening in order to see what it is that the adversary is thinking. Also strategic empathy, right? Right? You have to understand what is it that your adversary is thinking and planning, and not just how you think of it. That's narcissistic. And have the strategic competence in order to deal with this issue, with these issues. The United States has failed on all of these points, says McMaster, and we need to do something about it. Now, I mean, he recommends certain things that we should be doing in dealing with China and so forth. He was the National Security Advisor. Is the United States taking these actions? In the South China Sea, basically, America's policy has been to have freedom of navigation operations, which means we don't directly challenge what China's saying. What China's saying is that the entire South China Sea is sovereign Chinese territory, essentially belongs to China, which has no basis in any theory, but I'm going to talk a little bit about what they say is their theory. And what's very interesting about it, and what is the, kind of where the key point of distinction between the US and China is on the ability of military vessels to traverse the exclusive economic zone. Now, China says that if a military vessel traverses the exclusive economic zone, which they claim expansively based on their claims to a 9-dash line or a U-shaped line or a 4-shot line, historic rights, if you traverse, you must have permission to traverse the exclusive economic zone. There is no such basis in international law for such a claim. There's no such basis in international law, not at all. And what is the point that they make, and what is the linchpin, if you will, of the conflict in the South China Sea? But again, in each of these domains, whether it's Taiwan, in Taiwan they claim that Taiwan is part of China. Because they claim it's part of China. And the United States has what's called strategic ambiguity about that. But now our position, is changing to some extent. We have a Taiwan Relations Act, very worrisome. Economist magazine has its headline, "The most dangerous place on the earth is Taiwan." I mean, that's their claim because they believe it to be true. And it isn't true. Just because of strategic ambiguity, there are free people living on Taiwan. There are free people with aspirations living on Taiwan. On what basis does the Chinese Communist Party claim that they have Taiwan? How about Hong Kong? I mean, again, respect for law, respect for agreements. I mean, in Hong Kong, the Chinese did not respect the agreement that they made with the United Kingdom. They did not. They had a 99-year lease. They had an agreement. And there was supposed to be a transitional period, and they violated all of that. They violated the agreement up and down, and now, basically, under the national security law, I mean, they are violating the human rights of the people of Hong Kong. And if anybody can't wake up and see where this game goes, it goes straight to Taiwan and the South China Sea, which is an area of high, significant geopolitical importance to China and its survival. Now, just go back for a moment and look at the South. What are American perspectives on the South China Sea? So, the dispute in the South China Sea goes back to the age-old distinction between the idea whether or not the high sea should be open or closed. This was the dispute or the debate between Grotius and Selden on whether the high sea should be open, mare liberum, or closed, mare clausum. That is to say, this conflict of this theory has now morphed into a conflict between China and its neighbors in the South China Sea, because in effect, China says the South China Sea is a closed sea. It's a territory of China. The 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea codified the rules of the law of the sea, and also stemmed the tendency of coastal states to make extensive claims of sovereignty to areas of territorial sea, such as the claims of Chile, Ecuador, and Peru to 200-mile territorial waters, which was part of what I studied in my dissertation. UNCLOS establishes the maximum extension of the territorial sea at 12 miles and creates a 200-mile exclusive economic zone, EEZ, in which coastal states would have the power, the right to explore, exploit, conserve, and manage resources of the water column and under the seabed, right? Now, it's very, very interesting that where the dispute hinges in this whole issue has to do with China's claims of sovereignty of the South China Sea based on what it calls its historic rights, related to what it calls its 9-dash line or U-shaped line. If you can look these up, I didn't have a chance to bring these maps along, produces an enormous area of sovereign control claimed by China's exclusive economic zone or exclusive exclusion zone. And as I said earlier, China takes the position that foreign military vessels do not enjoy freedom of navigation in the in this extensive exclusion zone, which is contrary to all principles of international law. And the United States disagrees with that, obviously. Philippines brought a proceeding against China in the Permanent Court of Arbitration and seeking a ruling right, on the effect of the United Nations Conference on Law of the Sea, the agreement to China's claim to this historic right of the 9-dash line. The tribunal held there is no legal basis for China to claim historic rights to resources within the seas falling under the 9-dash line. Historic rights were extinguished when China acceded to the Law of the Sea agreement. But as I said before, the Chinese took the position that this decision and all of its ramifications were a piece of trash papers. Now, what is the big issue here? It has to do with islands and rocks. Islands and rocks. Under the Law of the Sea, islands have the same jurisdictional regime, territorial sea, economic, EEZ, and continental shelf as other land masses. The exception is to a rock, which are emergent lands that are unable to support human habitation or economic activity. While a rock has a territorial sea, it has no economic zone. What the Chinese have done is to take these rocks, to militarize and place landfill on them, to create islands, which will then have a territorial sea and an EEZ, exclusive economic zone. The Permanent Court of Arbitration held that these so-called islands that China has created in the South China Sea are in fact not islands, they are rocks, and therefore they have no exclusive economic zone and no basis for China's extension of its rights. Now this dispute overall kind of fizzled out because Rodrigo Duterte took the position that, you know, he didn't want to fight with China and end up having China do in effect at that time what China has done to Australia, which is essentially to take a hammer to kill a fly, which is to stomp down on anyone who ever criticizes China, whoever says anything against them, or whoever has the audacity to bring an action against them in the Permanent Court of Arbitration. So he said, Duterte, things were back to normal. But as we see, the foreign minister of Philippines lately with this incursions of these so-called fishing fleets, I mean, it's almost like, you know, we usually think a duck quacks, it's in the water, it's no, but no. In China, the fishing fleets are not fishing fleets. The Coast Guard is actually not a Coast Guard. It's actually part of the military forces of China. Utilization of the Coast Guard is very, very clever because the reason they use the Coast Guard is because if they have a confrontation with American or allied military forces, then that will not be a casus belli as you would have if you have actual confrontations of military vessels. So they said it's a Coast Guard. I mean, all of these things are strategic and one would say also somewhat Machiavellian. Again, Washington's position consistently has been to support the principle of the freedom of the high seas. Now, I want to say one thing about the Permanent Court of Arbitration, just to be fair, in the sense that I don't think China ever agreed to the jurisdiction of the Permanent Court of Arbitration in this case. That was one of the things that the court satisfied itself that it had jurisdiction. But, you know, at the end of the day, I think these principles are not, you know, are not so complicated that they can be understood because they're basic concepts in an agreement that China acceded to and signed up for, which is the distinction between rocks and islands. And again, America's position is that while the Law of the Sea established economic exclusion zones as a feature of international law, giving coastal states the right to regulate economic activities such as fishing and oil exploration within their EEZs, it does not give coastal states the right to regulate foreign military activities beyond their 12 nautical mile territorial waters. Now, what do we see happening here? One commentator says, and it's quite astute, China has entered the beginning, what's not the beginning stage, is the stage of direct challenge to the US-led order. China wants to project its power globally. And again, the question is, what does it all mean? Now, where the pushback comes not just from the United States, but also, quite interestingly, from the powers, from the states that are in the region. Now, one would never have predicted the United States having fought a war with Vietnam, that it is Vietnam and the United States that are now together and allied on the issue of Chinese bullying. I mean, in fact, I believe a number of Vietnamese were killed in casualties in a confrontation at the Johnson South Reef of the Chigwa Reef in 1988. I mean, China is very heavy-handed, even against Vietnam. So these conflicts between China and Vietnam, or the bullying of Vietnam, or the bullying of Philippines and the other nations, that, again, what is very interesting about this is that China makes claims, but the claims that it makes overlap the claims of a number of these countries. Well, I mean, again, China is a mega power, but these, and again, I would analogize that to the Belt and Road Initiative, where, again, the United States can play an important role in allying with these states that are being bullied and overpowered and intimidated by China by being a fulcrum against Chinese domination. Now, for example, the sovereignty disputes. There are numerous disputes over sovereignty, right, in this region. So in the northern part of the sea, China, Taiwan, and Vietnam contest sovereignty of the Paracel Islands. China has occupied them since 1974. In the southern part of the sea, China, Taiwan, and Vietnam claim all of the approximately 200 Spratly Islands, right? And then Brunei, Malaysia, and Philippines, right, claim some of them. Vietnam controls the greatest number. As you can see, this is complex. In the eastern part of the sea, China, Taiwan, and the Philippines all claim, just a moment, right, this Scarborough Shoal. China has controlled it since 2012. So again, China draws the 9-dash line, the U-shaped line, it draws the foreshore, draws lines. And none of these lines have any validity according to the International Forum. And yet these overlap the rights and claims of many other nations. Now, it's actually interesting that Taiwan itself, I believe, has an 11-dash line. I mean, you know, it is an absolute mess. And, you know, the thing I say about the law of the sea, which is why I love it, is that you can't solve these disputes. So if you look at the Eastern Mediterranean, for example, on which I focus quite a bit, I mean, how do you solve that? Every 5 minutes, somebody draws another line and makes another agreement, right? Turkey makes an agreement with Libya and they draw a line, right? An MOU. And then Egypt makes an agreement with Greece and they draw a line. Everybody's drawing lines. And then everybody sends in exploration ships. I mean, similarly here, the only difference is that you have one big Goliath power, mega power, right? Godzilla. I don't know if you have Godzilla in Portugal, but we do. Anyway, Godzilla comes and says, you know what? Okay, it's my territorial waters. If you don't like it, I'm sending my fishing fleets, but they're not fishing fleets. And I'm sending them, it's like the little green men, you know, little green men that the Russians send in. The Russians send little green men, and then they ask them, what are you doing in the Ukraine or wherever? I'm on vacation. With the same idea, the fishing fleets of China coming into the territorial waters of the Philippines. What are you doing there? We're fishing. And they're not fishing, right? So there's a certain element of, bluff, you know, that's involved here. And what it is, the problem is that the United States sits in the middle of all this. And how to deal with this is very, very problematic. Now, what's really happening is the United States is developing what Admiral Davidson described as something called the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, the PDI. And recently, the strategic framework for the Indo-Pacific was declassified. Can you imagine? I have it in my hand here. I'm actually shaking. Can you imagine? And it really is a very extraordinary short document that talks about what the United States intends to do. I want to just say this because I want to quote this from Admiral Davidson. Admiral Davidson says that the greatest long-term strategic threat in the 21st century is the People's Republic of China, period. And the Indo-Pacific, he says, is central to the world's economy, to the world's economic growth. 60% of the GDP and 2/3 of global economic growth will come from the Indo-Pacific. And the worry here is to how to deter the development development of China, the rise of China. So here are just a few from this declassified document, U.S. Strategic Framework for Countering China's Aggression, China's economic aggression, and strategic actions. Objective: deter China from using military force against the United States and U.S. allies or partners, and develop the capabilities and concepts to defeat Chinese actions across the spectrum of conflict actions. Enhance combat credible U.S. military presence and posture in the Indo-Pacific region to uphold U.S. interests and security commitments. Devise and implement a defense strategy capable of, but not limited to, denying China sustained air and sea dominance and decide the first island chain in the conflict, defending the first island chain nations, including Taiwan, dominating all domains outside the first island chain. That's pretty strong. There's no strategic ambiguity in this. We're going to defend Taiwan. I just have to say this, from my memory, there used to be a time in this country way back when the nationalists fled to the island, where there was a lot of sympathy for the nationalists, for Taiwan, for the people who fled communism. Over the years, the development of the One China policy has somewhat muddied the waters to some extent. And I just wanted to say one interesting thing, if I may, and that is former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, who is a very, very sharp guy, I think, very smart. He has an article in the Foreign Affairs magazine, I think the latest one, how to keep U.S.-Chinese confrontation from ending in calamity. That's a very good thing. If you figure that out, Prime Minister, you get the Nobel Prize. I just want to say that right away, in addition to the people who developed the vaccines. So this is what he says. Interesting. How do we do this? All right. Both sides must abstain from cyber attacks from each other. Okay. Now, here's a good one. Washington must return to strictly adhering to the One China policy, especially by ending the Trump administration's provocative and unnecessary high-level visits to Taipei. For its part, Beijing must dial back its recent pattern of provocative military exercises, deployments, and maneuvers in the Taiwan Strait. In the South China Sea, Beijing must not reclaim or militarize any more islands and must commit to respect freedom of navigation and aircraft movement without challenge. For its part, the United States and its allies could then reduce the number of operations they carry out in the sea. China and Japan should cut back their military deployments in the East China Sea by mutual agreement over time. All right, so I filed this away into Wishful Thinking 101. This is the Wishful Thinking 101 file. Now, you know, I always say, I'm sorry, this is going to be a very strong statement, but here it is, okay? If you wake up in the morning tomorrow and there are 3 moons in the sky, then Rudd's approach to this will take place. I would say in Las Vegas, there is a zero chance that the Chinese will dial back their provocations, and that the United States will return to a strictly One China policy. That is just, there is no going back to that, because that policy was untenable. I mean, maybe it was strategic ambiguity fit in the time period when it was a square peg in a square hole, but it isn't anymore. We're past that point. We're past that point. Where Counselor Wang, when he gives his talk, he makes it very clear that the United States cannot, it even says it very clearly. He says, if you think, he says it again, he says reunification is an overarching trend of history. We will continue to work with the greatest sincerity to achieve peaceful reunification. We oppose separatist activities or any form of Taiwan independence, right? And as again, he says, go near it. Playing the Taiwan card is playing with fire. I don't think you can have a more explicit statement of what the Chinese have in mind. Now, just to back for a moment on the South China Sea, I mean, I think the South China Sea is very important. The militarization of the South China Sea is very important, but it's only one aspect of the entire strategy here, which is military development, naval development, Belt and Road Initiative, string of pearls, creating militarized ports, expanding the power of China out. It needs to do that because it's dependent on resources, it's dependent, and it needs to also confront India. I mean, what in the world was going on in the Galwan Valley where the Chinese were killing Indian troops? You scratch your head, but yeah, there's a direct confrontation. This is why China is worried about South China Sea. It's worried about Malacca Strait. It's worried about these things because the United States, if it could suppress or compress or restrict China's right to expand. I mean, Admiral Harry Harris, has said that he called the militarization of these islands, the creation of what he calls the Great Wall of Sand, the Great Wall of Sand, almost like a Great Wall, like the Great Wall of China. This China's perspective on the world needs to be understood much, much better by the United States. I mean, Australia has stood up and it has pushed back against China and has taken some repercussions for that. But again, we have to be very, very astute in dealing with this threat. Now, in the recent annual threat assessment of that Director of National Intelligence, I mean, if you look at the threats, the first threat, China-India border tensions remain high. Second point, in the South China Sea, Beijing will continue to intimidate rival claimants and will use growing numbers of air, naval, and maritime law enforcement platforms to signal to Southeast Asian countries that China has effective control over contested areas, and the pressure also on Japan in the East China Sea. But Beijing will press Taiwan to move towards unification. And at the same time, we worry about China's increasing cooperation with Russia. And the ongoing development of Belt and Road Initiative to expand China's power. Also, China using vaccine diplomacy to expand its influence and power. And also technological competitiveness. Also the area of military competition, which we talked about before. So again, when the Secretary of State talks about or the President talks about cooperation and competition, and trying to do those two things, that is going to be very, very difficult to do and almost formidable to do. You can't do both. You need to obviously work with China, I suppose, but is working with China on climate change, is that a sufficient framework to make a peaceful world on climate change when the Chinese are promising something going forward that they may or may not implement? So at the end of the day, I wouldn't say that we should be pessimistic, optimistic, but we should certainly be realistic about the ability of the United States and its allies to, and particularly the Quad, hopefully to work together to, I wouldn't say the word containment, maybe that's a little bit too strong, but to be able to work with China. I know Professor Tomei has a whole concept, engagement and containment. That would be very nice to be able to do it, but I don't know how we engage with China when their underlying efforts and objectives appear to be so contrary to American interest in the world. Anyway, I think it's about 45 minutes, so I hope I didn't go too long.
Thank you, Professor Mark Meirowitz, for your presentation. Very interesting and very passionate. We are now open the Q&A period, inviting all to submit your questions directly. Just let me know if you want to do so or via chat. And to open the debate, I'll give the floor to Professor Carlos Gaspar. Carlos, please.
You're muted.
Yeah, o som.
Thank you very much, Professor Meirowitz. It was an education on the United States and China and on maritime law. As you well know, the Portuguese have an ambiguous stance vis-à-vis mare clausum, and you remember the polemics between Grotius and Serafim Freitas, where our eminent jurist wrote a book on the just Asiatic empire of the Portuguese to defend our monopoly, our trade monopoly in Asia, which had been ratified by the Pope. We have since gave away this claim, but of course, when we hear back the polemics with Grotius, it still hurts that we lost our Asian empire. But well, things change, apparently. I quite agree with you, one that I think is the two main points. First one is that the old Joseph Nye strategy of mixing balancing and engaging is in the past. Containment is the new US strategy. It has been consolidated in the last 4 years. And I think, perhaps I'm too optimistic, but I think that it will prevail in the present debate over US strategy towards China. Also, I think it's very important to stress that nobody, either in Washington or in Brussels, in the United States or in Europe, now looks at China as a regional power, or represents the Chinese strategy as basically a regional strategy concentrating on Asia and on expelling the United States from Asia, separating the United States from its allies. But I think that we have not yet taken stock of what it means to say that China has a global strategy, meaning that it has, on the one hand, a Eastern strategy concentrating on the South China Sea, Taiwan, and so on and so forth. And also then it has a Western strategy of building up a separate order, alongside with Russia, a separate order in the Eurasian landmass. I think it, when you look at China, we should recognize that it has these two strategies, and that is developing these two strategies at the same time. Not there is no priority, there is no obvious priority being given to the maritime strategy in Asia, to the maritime confrontation with the United States in Asia. And I think there is no obvious priority to this maritime confrontation with the United States in Asia for at least two reasons. The first one is the Quad, because the Quad, the alliance, the coalition, if you will, engaging the United States, Australia, but Japan and India, is a very powerful instrument to contain China. It's very difficult, even for a rising superpower, to face up to this extended coalition. And the second reason is that China has the largest navy in the world in the number of vessels, but its navy, its military navy, is about a third of the tonnage of the American Navy. And this, I think, makes quite a difference when it comes to capacity building and comparing the relative power of the United States Navy and the new Chinese Navy. So I think that we should look at once to this Eastern strategy, this maritime strategy, but also to the other Western strategy in which building up rules to regulate the cyberspace, rules to regulate the new digital economy, rules to define new multilateral institutions, including Russia, including India and Pakistan, are more and more central to this Chinese strategy. And I wonder, I mean, I think that the Indo-Pacific strategy has a strong place and is consolidated as a strong priority in US strategy, but you need to develop this second strategy to counter the normative Western strategy, which is being built around the Belt and Road Initiative, around relations with Russia and so on and so forth. But that's my comment on your very excellent presentation. Thank you.
I always learn a great deal from Professor Gaspar. First point. Second point, about the multilateral institutions, United Nations, participation in the so-called rules order, which in fact, Councillor Wang talks about. He says that that's what we should be developing, you know, as you say. But I think if you look at Chinese adherence to international institutions, I mean, basically, their strategy is to co-opt those institutions and to bend them to their will in order to facilitate and implement their objectives. And that, I don't think, was the reason the United States and its allies got together with the United Nations in the first place. The idea of that was to create a peaceful world with a rules-based order, with collective security to prevent aggression, to prevent countries from taking over Taiwan, to prevent countries from invading Crimea. That would be the purpose. The only problem with the United Nations is that there's a veto, and the great powers cannot be the object of those institutions to stop them from doing these types of things. And in fact, if you look at China, China has kind of gone into all these different specialized agencies to take them over. I mean, that's very, very worrisome. They don't want to be criticized, and they want to use this to implement their policies. And as far as the WHO, I mean, that is the poster child of Chinese intimidation and co-optation, where they've co-opted this institution to the point where it can't function. And nobody believes what they have to say. I mean, we know in the United States, we have a lot of dispute if the CDC is saying something or not. But the WHO, to my mind, is maybe, I don't know, I didn't take a poll, but I wouldn't believe anything they have to say, because they weren't at the beginning. They didn't, they never did what they were supposed to do, and China co-opted them. And we know that China is very sensitive about this subject, about the virus, and need I say more about it, what they did to Australia, and also their inability to share any information about it. So on that point, multilateral institutions and their participation in it, about the digital economy and 5G and Huawei, I mean, there is another trust factor. If you look at Chinese and Russian intervention in democratic societies, there's another worrisome activity where they're using what we call sharp power to intervene. Now, about the Belt and Road Initiative. Belt and Road Initiative, appear to be an altruistic effort on the part of China to help these struggling countries. But no, it really wasn't. It was purely, again, a facilitation of the policy of the Chinese Communist Party. And, you know, it's interesting, when you mention the Eastern strategy, I mean, they're doing Belt and Road in Panama. I mean, they're here. The Russians and the Chinese are right here. I thought there was a Monroe Doctrine. I thought President Monroe made a doctrine that foreign powers are supposed to stay out of the North American continent. But we've got Iranians in Venezuela and Russians and Chinese and in Panama, Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, I think that bolsters tremendously the point that their strategy is a global strategy. Yes, it's true that at the present time, they're not quite ready in terms of their ability to develop, to be at the upgrade to the point, but they are working on it. That's exactly what these reports show. They are working on upgrading their defenses, not just defenses, but offensive weaponry. That's the thing that has opened the eyes of the military planners. What kinds of weapons are they developing? They're developing weapons that can destroy aircraft carriers. I mean, really? I mean, so in other words, it's almost as if there was a sheath or something over the strat. Suddenly it opens up like in a play. You know, the curtain opened and China, you have a global policy. What a shock. What a shock. You want to take over the world? Well, it's not just the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, it's to mold the world in their manner. Well, they show that wherever they go. Wherever they go, they show the blueprint for what they would do if they could have more hegemony and more power. So I think the good news is they didn't bide their time anymore. They actually said all these things out loud, and that is great, because then people will wake up and say, we need to do something about it. On the Belt and Road Initiative, the United States and its allies and other countries should go in and bail out all these countries. I mean, there was one leader, I think, in Africa who said, it was quoted in The Economist, he took power and then he found out what the predecessor had signed up for in the Belt and Road Initiative, and he said, my predecessor must have been drunk. He must have been intoxicated when he signed such a deal. I mean, really? So China has a strategy. It is not altruistic. And I think that the rules-based order of the United States and Europe and its allies, that at the end, because even at the time when the Soviet Union was very powerful and there was a Cold War, everybody said, this is never going to change. They're so powerful. We'll never, ever succeed. And guess what? Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall and goodbye wall. No more Berlin Wall. And it's actually interesting because, you know, comparatively, I mean, one of the commentators compares the South China Sea, this is actually relevant to the point Professor Gaspar made about the West. He calls it China's Caribbean, you know? So we used to have the Caribbean, and now, so they want to create their zone of influence, and they want to use that to expand out to the rest of the world. So I think the world needs to be very wary and very concerned, but it's not a hopeless cause, because it seemed to be a hopeless cause with the Soviet Union, and you know what? There's no more Soviet Union. It fell. And the more that the Chinese intimidate these smaller countries, the more they push down. I said, one Chinese commentator said, if the Chinese continue, as a Chinese commentator, then maybe the Filipinos will let the U.S. back into Subic Bay. Maybe there'll be a whole shift in terms of becoming much more pro-American than these countries have been traditionally somewhat anti-American. So, you know, what I'm saying is that, you know, you can never predict what's going to happen, but I can say this, I know, I feel, and I pray that democracy will always triumph and freedom will triumph, and the kind of things that go on in Hong Kong and the threats of invading Taiwan and the Russian actions in the Ukraine, these things will pass. They will, if we get together and we're allied. And you mentioned the Quad, and it's I agree with you, is very important. Because China's very, very worried about the Quad. It's worried about Japan. It's worried about India. It's very, very worried about Australia. Look at their behavior. Look at their reaction to Australia. All Australia did was to say, can we look into what happened with the coronavirus? That's all they said. And then the action was overpowering against them. So the Chinese are very sensitive to criticism, as are the Russians. Authoritarians are sensitive. We just have to keep up the pressure. But hopefully the Biden administration will be pragmatic and effective in how it deals with these things. And I think that they're multitasking on a number of different levels right now. And that's very, very worrisome, because I don't know whether you can multitask on all of these issues successfully at the same time.
Thank you. We have 3 more questions from Paulo Manso. He's asking what's next about the eventual containment from the USA to China and Russia. Is this containment going to work to such a powerful China, strategic all over the world? Paulo Santos is asking, the US has reaffirmed its support for Taiwan and to ensure its defense from Chinese threats. Following this position, is it possible that an incident or attack, a Chinese attack on Taiwan, there will be direct US intervention? I think he's thinking in a war, direct war between China and US on Taiwan. And also João Fernandes is asking, Professor Meirowitz, you mentioned the Trump administration had harsher policies towards China. Did it ever go beyond just rhetoric thought? I don't mean to sound insolent, but I don't see what calling Corona the China virus is supposed to accomplish. So, Mark, 3 questions altogether.
Well, I'll do the last one first, because that's very intriguing. I mean, no, calling the Wuhan, the virus, coronavirus, the China virus has no, validity, and nevertheless, Trump said it. And if you think anything that he said isn't worth anything, then just look at the Republican Party, okay? He still controls the Republican Party. So, all the things he said, and as wild and as crazy as they were, he's still an influential politician in the United States. So, no, to try to understand that is absolutely befuddling. It's very hard to understand. But part of his influence and part of his popularity is based on these kinds of statements and claims that he made. Now, look, about the virus. How did the virus start? There's a biopret facility in Wuhan. It's not a secret. I think the United States even funds it. And it could have been that it escaped from there. Who knows? Nobody, we don't know. There's actually a lawsuit in, I think it's in Missouri, I don't remember exactly, where the state is suing China for damages to the citizens of the state from the COVID virus, right? So they've actually, can you imagine, they're going to make a discovery request. They're going to write a letter to China and ask them to provide all the documents in the litigation about how the virus started. I remember I was working in a law firm, and we had a pro bono project to help someone who had been imprisoned by the communist Soviet Union for Helsinki Watch, for human rights activity, and for opposing Helsinki. And I actually wrote a brief and sent it to the KGB, and they actually signed my receipt for the mail, and then they released her. I don't know if it was my fault or someone else. So I don't know. If you think you can get China to give you information on the virus, I wish you Godspeed. Using the terminology that he used, I don't know what to say about it. That was Trump. Trump became president, lost the presidency, and is still influential in American politics. So in terms of his China policy, in terms of being, strong on China, yes, I suppose he was strong on China, not very strong on Russia. And so maybe there's some vestiges of that will be helpful, but I'm not so sure. About the incident on Taiwan, I hope and pray that never happens. I think here is where deterrence and the deterrence movements of the United States are really crucial. And also the fact that the United States needs to be very clear. I mean, Richard Haas has an article in Foreign Affairs in the last issue where he says that the time for strategic ambiguity is over. We need to be very, very clear in the United States of how we would react to such an action. I mean, the point to tie into what Professor Gaspar said, obviously, this is in the Chinese neck of the woods. It's in their immediate proximity. So can the United States effectively defend Taiwan? I mean, it remains to be seen. We don't know if it's feasible to do so. But the key is to make the right statements and to show our alliance with Taiwan under the Taiwan Relations Act, and that the United States would take steps to defend Taiwan. And it's clear that that's a no-brainer. Our support of Taiwan should be absolutely immutable, unconditional, and not with the slightest hesitation. The United States should defend Taiwan. The question is, in a country like the United States that is pulling out of Afghanistan and making deals with Iran and doing all these things, is that something the United States that the American people will want to be doing at this point? I mean, you know, again, that's a very, very big factor. We do have the impact of domestic public opinion that has an effect. So the answer to your question is, I don't know, and I pray it never actually happens. But with strong statements from the president, and making the right statements, I think the Chinese will not be so foolish as to try that one. I don't think so. As far as the point about containing Russia and China, I mean, Russia, that's a whole other debate, discussion, a lecture. Russia is not at the level of a China. It's not really a major power. On the other hand, it uses its assets very cleverly. It uses mischief, malevolence, trickery, hacking, taking out the gas supplies of the southern United States. I mean, through hacking. I mean, that's very, very effective. Again, I really loved Fiona Hill's explanation of this, and I just think it's so clever. She talks about the game of hearts, and I don't play hearts, so I don't know how to play. Maybe some of you play cards, but the idea of it was that Russia has when they play cards with you, you can have a very good hand, but they don't have a good hand, but they bluff you. They bluff you. They don't have much, but they trick you and bluff you, and that is what she sees as their way of operating, because they don't have the power to oppose a superpower like the United States, not at the present time. Yes, they have nuclear weapons and all of that, but they do have the ability to use what they have very effectively, and much of that is mischief and malevolence, hacking, trickery, and the Chinese do too. And they've used it, and also the sharp power part, and that's very important too. And that's the interference in American democracy, in American elections, Confucius institutes, trying to undermine democracies around the world. This is where they are focusing their limited assets, and to some success, creating dissension and an upheaval in American and democracies is a definite policy of the Chinese and the Russians. Sharp power is the term that Christopher Walker has developed for this, and it's a pretty interesting point. If you look at the Confucius Institutes, what's the purpose of that? I mean, I was in a conference in Lancaster, England, and there was a speaker from the Confucius Institute at University of Lancaster in England, and he made the following statement, and I must say this out loud, unbelievable. There were 90 or 100 academics sitting there. He said something about Xi Jinping or whatever, and he's describing the Communist Party. So I raised my hand and I asked, wait a minute, how does the Communist Party, how do you create new and vibrant leadership in a party when there's a leader for life and everything is sort of in a silo where you have everything controlled by the leader for life? This is the answer this professor gave from Confucius Institute. Xi Jinping, I mean, look, he could have his opinion, but you could disagree with him. You know, I mean, we don't always agree with Xi Jinping. If we don't agree with him, we could say whatever we want. Now, I mean, I would have thought that people would have started laughing out loud. They're called LOL, because this is the most ridiculous statement in the world, because you cannot oppose the leader for life. You cannot oppose the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, it's ridiculous. Yet this is all a form of projection of China and its in campuses and academia to create I think a vision of China that's not correct. I think, and there's a great respect and love for Chinese culture and Chinese history, but the way to project it out is not to bring out a false narrative, about what it is they're trying to do and the purpose of those Confucius Institutes. I think now in the United States, I think they're phasing a lot of those out. And so in any event, as far as the sanctions are concerned against Russia, sanctions against Russia have been implemented, and and also China, EU has sanctions against China, and China backed sanctions. The Chinese sanctions were much more, I think, attacking European institutions. The EU sanctions attacked individuals. The Chinese sanctions were, again, China cannot handle criticism. They need to hit back like an elephant crushing a mouse. They have to hit back very hard because they cannot countenance criticism. And I think the best way to engage is to have a dialogue. A dialogue would be great. It would be great to have meaningful competition with China. It would be great. And I pray for that, for a peaceful world. I certainly hope that happens. But I don't know.
Thank you, Mark. Your mention on playing cards, because Russians are known for being an excellent chess players, not poker.
Right, and specific, yes, chess. That's right. Yes, chess, and not only chess, but the foreign policy theorists talk about three-dimensional chess. Because they definitely play three-dimensional chess. There's no question about it. And with very little on their plate, they're able to use that for their benefit, and they're quite good at it. And look, they've been doing it for a long time, as have the Chinese.
The last three questions, not to take you too long, from Nasser Ajaloghi. Professor, don't you think that China grew because USA and Europe many years ago transferred factories and technology to China? Could the West be the main culprit for this Chinese growth that has become a threat to the United States? And I also have two questions, provocative questions, Mark. About South China Sea, there are many paradoxes, and one of the most curious is that the United States accuses China, and rightly so, of not respecting the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, to which China is a party, but the US is not. The US never accessed or ratified UNCLOS. Can you explain why the US does not accede to the UNCLOS Convention, not least to gain moral authority vis-a-vis China in the South China Sea and East China Sea? And the final question is, I'd like to hear your comment on two statements from your colleagues from the United States. Emma Ashford, for example, both published in the Foreign Policy recently. Emma Ashford, for example, notes that great power competition is a recipe for disaster, adding that it is unclear why the United States is competing and that the Biden administration, like Trump's, makes competition itself the apparent end. And in the same vein, Zachary Caraval says that the Trump got China all wrong. Now Biden is too. Confrontation may be popular at home, but it won't make the United States more prosperous or secure. Mark, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I thought this was going to be fun. I'm just kidding. All right. So anyway, well, first of all, the transfer of technology. Boy, what I knew was a tough group. Everybody looked so serious in the beginning. Transfer of technology. Well, yes, of course. I mean, that is a great point. It's almost, what is it, is it Lenin, or I think it's Lenin, that says that the capitalists will provide the wherewithal to us to, so we can destroy them. I mean, but the thing is that on the technology, that should have been a wake-up call. But it was not just on technology. I mean, I have a friend who was in the textile business, and his father was in a textile business, did a lot of deals with China. And he always told me, Mark, come on, if I do a deal with China and they don't like the contract, they can just, I'm a lawyer in the United States. I never heard of such a thing. If they don't like the contract, they can just say it's void. Because when you make a contract with the Chinese government, they can tell you whatever they want to tell you. You take a risk. So that already was, mind-boggling. But the same thing with technology. The whole idea of doing the interactions, the business interactions by China was to get access to the technology. I mean, that's clear. But again, hope springs eternal. And, American business, and European business would always think that we're going to do a deal with China. We're going to do a deal. They're going to become prosperous. They're going to become powerful, rich and powerful, and they're going to be just like us. And guess what? That didn't happen. So the answer to your question is sure. Kissinger's opening to China, absolutely. All the things that America did, bringing the WTO, we did all the good things with good intentions, right? Clinton, bring WTO. Why do it? To bring China in and make it part of community of nations and operate by the rules. But again, that was never China's intention. And that's really, it's sad, but true. But again, the writing was on the wall. How about UNCLOS? That's a really good question. Now, look, the big problem, and it's the similar problem with International Criminal Court and other international institutions, but the one with UNCLOS, the issue there had a lot to do with the with the idea that the resources, what Arvid Pardo called the common heritage of mankind, would be the common heritage of mankind in the sense that the international institution created by UNCLOS would literally distribute or redistribute the resources and the benefits to disadvantaged nations, landlocked nations, third world nations, and American corporations did not go for that. I can tell you that when I was doing my dissertation along the way, I was kind of interacting with people on the delegations to the Law of the Sea Conference. There were a lot of corporate representatives who were sitting there because they wanted to make sure that the United States didn't give up valuable resources, in particular the minerals of the deep sea bed, to the international authority. They said, no, we don't want that because we don't want to give an international institution the power to redistribute valuable minerals and materials that should belong to the United States. So that, among other reasons, there was a lot of domestic political impact on that. So yes, I think we never ratified it, and there's been a lot of movement along the way by different politicians, political leaders in the Senate to say we should ratify it, but it's unlikely to be ratified. Same issue to some extent International Criminal Court, but that's not giving international institutions authority over the United States and its assets, and that's the reason. So that does fly somewhat in the face of the idea that the United States is a big proponent of international law. But I can tell you this, though, and I think this is an important point. And my focus in my dissertation was fisheries. And, the one thing was a tremendous dispute in the United States between the coastal fishermen and the deep water fishermen. And the State Department said, we don't want to create, restrictive zones, even though the foreign fishermen were fishing out the stocks, because we comply with international law. Yeah, it was ad nauseum. You would read this over and over and over again. Senators and the State Department who supported the idea that America is in favor of compliance with international law. And I do believe that is the basic premise of American jurisprudence and American law, and that international law is part of American law. But on this particular one, it wasn't about law, it was about politics. And politics ruled. The corporations, the interest groups, that were strong enough to prevent this from being done. It would have been a very good thing. It's for the common heritage of mankind, but American corporate interests were not in favor of it. Now, on the point of the confrontation being a recipe for disaster and competition being the end, actually, Henry Kissinger has an article where he talks about U.S. He's the one who opened it up, but now he's worried that U.S.-China competition would be a calamity for the world. That's right. That's another wake-up call. But you know, I don't think, you know, it talks about competition. I don't know that we are at this point. We were competing. We were competing with China. We were working on trade was the main issue. All these years, trade and competition and trade. I don't think that's the main issue today. The main issue on the agenda is to avoid this calamity in terms of working out a way to deter China, but not actually confronting China in a direct confrontation. Now about Trump, that's American politics in a nutshell. You know, confrontation with China was very popular among Trump's base, right? I mean, if you watched his rallies, whenever he said China virus, everybody started screaming in happiness. You know, it was almost like a Rorschach test. But Biden doesn't have the same base. Biden doesn't have the same base. But if you look at Biden right now, and if you look at Biden's list of priorities, China's way up there, and one could argue the Middle East is way, way, way down, okay? Way down. Whether it should be there or should not be there is a debate. We could debate it, but China is the main, and Biden and his people are focused on that. China, Russia, and of course, Afghanistan, and of course, Iran, as working a deal with Iran. He's got his list, he's got his bucket list, and Middle East is not on the list, and China is on the list. So it's good that it's on the list. It's good that you know, that the United States and its allies are being assertive, but it's not good, so I think, to have, you know, shouting matches and screaming matches between two superpowers in Anchorage. That's not good. If you want to disagree privately, but let's not ratchet up the dissension and disapproval of one another. You know, each time to call the press, and I want to make a statement, let the press come back in. America should not, and then the Americans, another Chinese, and the finger pointing. There's no good to come. No good comes from that. No good comes from that. You get not from those words. Your actions will be effective, and particularly on Taiwan. To me, Taiwan is the linchpin, is the litmus test. It's the canary in the mine. Well, sort of Hong Kong was sort of a canary in the mine, but now Taiwan will be the canary in the mine. Very, very dangerous. Dangerous, dangerous, dangerous. And it needs to be toned down. China needs to tone down its ideas, and America also. And we need to, no strategic ambiguity. That needs to go away. We need to be clear. And we need to be, as McMaster says, stop our strategic narcissism, boost our strategic confidence, and be very attuned to strategic empathy. And if we do all those things, then I think we have a, you know, hope for a peaceful world.
Professor Mark Meirowitz, on behalf of all of us, many thanks for your availability and sharing of knowledge. I please ask all participants to join me in a virtual applause to our distinguished guest using the reactions button in the Zoom bar below. Yeah.
Don't you love Zoom? I love Zoom.
Yeah,
Don't you? Just expresses. And thank you, and I want to thank you very much for the kind invitation and the opportunity to have the privilege of having this discussion with all of you, and I've certainly learned a lot from all the great questions. They were just great, and this discussion goes on, and hopefully it works itself out in a peaceful fashion.
We keep in touch. Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
And we'll see you
So
soon.
long. So long.
Os nossos alunos, daqui a meia hora, sensivelmente, estamos na nossa aula, que eu recordo, no outro Zoom. Mark, thank you. See you. Bye. Então, boa noite a todos. Mantenham-se com saúde. Keep safe, Mark. Bye.